Israelites aren't fundamentally better humans because they also practice child sacrifice. They also act like the Sodomites, right? And commit sexual assault against a visitor in their home. So all of this is actually, the Bible is trying to show, yeah, the Bible fundamentally agrees people are broken and sinful and terrible, and that's why we're in need of a Redeemer. And that even goes, for the Crusades, right? Someone brings up the Crusades. It's very viable to point out that the first couple of Crusades were not like this wholesale genocide of brown-skinned people that they're portrayed to be, right? The first couple of Crusades were geopolitical wars, not totally dissimilar from the 7 Years' War, the 60-year, pick your European conflict, right? These were multiple nations going to war over things that matter to them. So the first couple of Crusades, treating them like they were somehow worse than any other law is pretty foolish. Specifically, when the early Crusades started, because radical Muslim conquests were kicking out and were killing Christians in the Holy Land, forbidding them from worship. And so what the First Crusade started out as was a response to Christian princes in the East begging for help against persecution. Now, this is not, the point of this class is not an apotheosis of the Crusades, but it's just worth saying that, one, don't accept the critique on face value, but two, our answer to this is, yeah, people are terrible. There were terrible things that happened in the Crusades, right? One of the Crusades, the Crusaders got to Constantinople, they looked around, they saw a lot of gold, and they say, forget this, and they sacked Constantinople and killed thousands and thousands of people. One of the worst things in history is something called the Children's Crusade, when some false teachers in the church decided that the reason the previous crusades had failed was because the crusaders were too sinful. And you know who's less sinful are kids. So what we need to do is raise up an army of kids. And they did. Tens of thousands of kids. They marched through Europe. They got to the ports and they were all promptly sold into slavery. It was awful. People are terrible. They're fundamentally wicked, broken, sinful people. It is only the grace of God that prevents us all from being the worst version of ourselves. That's our answer. Yes, people are terrible. It's God who stands in opposition to that sin. It's God who judges it and rebukes it and punishes it. So yes, people are terrible. That in no way makes God terrible. He's the one who's judging them. This is, I think, a more juvenile attack, but it's one you'll hear, right? I think specifically with the Crusades, most people, I don't think, are biblically literate enough to attack Christianity because of the tribe of Benjamin. It's usually like the Crusades. Yes, Tim?
In many ways, that's the beauty of the Bible. It shows you the flaws.
Yes. A radically honest book. Amen. That talks about how sinful God's people are. Right from Judah and his brothers, to Moses' failings, to David's failings, to Peter and Paul's failings. You're right. It's a radically honest book. So we fundamentally accept that people are terrible. That's kind of the whole point. So that's our response to that objection. Next one is the idea that God in the Old Testament, usually it's the Old Testament, sanctions, promotes evil. And the way this usually comes about is the question of slavery. So, when you have this idea, when someone tells you, well, the Old Testament, God approves of sin. He approves of terrible things. Here's this verse where God says this. My commendation to you is make them keep reading. Like, don't let them stop at one verse they pull out of context. So the one you'll hear, I'm assuming, will be Exodus 21:7, when a man desires to sell his daughter into slavery, step 1, step 2, step 3. And they go, that's your God. Selling daughters into slavery, isn't that terrible? Well, it certainly sounds terrible, but can we maybe not take one verse out of context? Can we maybe talk about biblical slavery? So there are a couple different contexts to Jewish slavery, and none of this is extra biblical. It's just in there. Like, just read Exodus 21, read Deuteronomy. So it's Exodus 21 through chapter 24 is something called the covenant code, right? And it's separated from the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments is Exodus 20. And then Moses starts giving more law, verse 21. And it has that connecting clause. So now tell the people because of the Ten Commandments. And then 21 through 24 is called the Book of the Covenant. And what this is, it's case law. And case law is a legal idea where it applies fundamental concepts to real-life examples, right? And actually, the Old Testament law code is overwhelmingly case law. Outside of the Decalogue, which is this clearly eternal, lasting thing for God's people, Old Testament law is case law, which is, as a really quick aside, why it shouldn't be implemented anymore. Because we don't take case law from England and just put it in place in America. That's not how it works. That's the opposite of the idea of case law. But basically, Exodus is case law. And so one of the first things you see in Exodus 21 is God detailing how Hebrew slaves are supposed to be treated. what's interesting about, this is deep cut, so no worries, but does anyone know what's interesting about the descriptions of Hebrew slaves in Exodus 21? Alexander. Right. Right. So both those are true. Right. Yes. Right. Right. Amen. So Alexander's fundamental point is, this is about slaves' rights. The Exodus 21 discourse is about the rights of slaves to be treated with dignity, right? Did you want to know what other ancient law code detailed the laws, the rights of slaves? And the answer is easy. None of them. None of them. The Roman law code, right, written 2,000 years later, had far less protections for slaves than this does. So fundamentally, first off, everything that's happening here in Exodus 21 is about the right and defenses of slaves. But here's what's really, really fascinating. By the time the Deuteronomic law code that was passed, you weren't supposed to take Hebrew slaves anymore, except for a couple circumstances that we'll get to. And so this pulls out one of the most important parts of the Old Testament law, is that it's case law, which means it is concessory. Did I say that word right? It's a concession, right? And now this is not me saying this is Jesus saying this. When someone asks him, what about divorce? And what does Jesus say? Divorce was given because of the hardness of your hearts. You are all wicked people, right? And you all wickedly sin against each other. And if the only way out of divorce was stoning to death every single adulterer, there would be none of you left. All of my people would be dead. And I don't want that to happen, right? I'm here to save you, right? So the gracious way out of adultery that should be punishable by death is what? Is divorce. And so nowadays we go, well, God hates divorce. God does hate divorce, right? It's a wicked, terrible sin, breaks apart families, it's rebellion against God's law. And yet, right, if everyone who committed adultery was stoned, there would be nobody left. And so God in his grace creates a law with concessions in it to human sin and failings, right? That is the justice and wisdom of God, right? Don't commit adultery. Don't get divorced. That's the express will of God in the scriptures. Do not do this. But a law code that has zero plans for lawbreakers is a bad law. Just say that, right? This is like the people who talk about why we have to make, I'm not trying to take a place on gun control, but people who are like, what we need to do to get rid of gun crime is to make guns illegal. Because what criminals are famous for doing is following laws, right? So good laws take into account law breaking, right? That's why there's divorce in Exodus, and Jesus upholds it in Matthew 19, and that's the position of the Westminster Confession of Faith, that there is allowable divorce, although it's a terrible sin. Slavery is also a concessionary law, right? Is Alexander's point. You are all terrible people, right? And so, when you do these things, you have to treat the slaves with respect. You cannot harm them, you cannot kill them, they have fundamental rights. And one of the ways we even see that progress is that the Exodus application of the law, by the time we get to Deuteronomy and God's people are growing and changing, the law is fulfilled and moves on to now you can't just take Hebrew slaves except for debt slavery. And there's more, we'll get to more. It's increasingly small reasons, right? But the most common reason for ancient Egyptian slavery is debt slavery. And so when people see slavery in Exodus 21, you can sell your daughter, what they immediately go to is American racial chattel slavery, which was awful, and a clear prohibition of the book of Deuteronomy, which absolutely bans kidnapping and impressing people. It's called man-stealing, and it's punishable by death in the Deuteronomic Code. So American slavery was a terrible, wicked sin, clearly denounced by the Bible. That's not what's happening here, right? Debt slavery is when someone is homeless, impoverished, can't pay their debts, and so as a way to pay off their debts, they pledge themselves in slavery to a debtor, either to the person they owe money to or to someone else, usually someone from your family, who's willing to pay off your debts, and in return, you're pledged to slavery to them. So what's the big difference already from debt slavery to American chattel slavery? Right. You chose to do it. You said, I need this. The other big problem is, goes to Alexander's point, from the previous point, Deuteronomy then goes on when the Deuteronomic law code is being applied to debt slavery is every 7 years, there's something called the year of Jubilee. And on that 7th year, you have to set those slaves free. Right? Not what's happening in America. Not what's happening anywhere in the world at any point during slavery. Right? Is every 7th year they have to be set free. But they don't just have to be set free, because guess what happens when they get set free? Deuteronomy says they have to be sent off loaded with goods like you were when you left Egypt, because you were once slaves and I saved you. And if you remember, the scene as they're leaving Egypt is that they plunder it, right? They take all of the gold out of the house of Pharaoh and they're loaded down with goods, the Israelites are. That's what they have to be. When you set your slave free the 7th year, you're not just setting them free, you have to fill their arms with food and with money. That's the express law of Hebrew debt slavery, which is, again, completely different. Because the point of this slavery is making two people whole, right? The debtors have rights. You've basically stolen money from them and from society, and so you have to pay it back, right? In our current system, and I'm not here to, I don't know how to reform our prison system, but one of the problems with our prison system is that very few people benefit from it, right? Hey, you stole a bunch of money from me. Oh, who's the Ponzi scheme guy? Madoff. Hundreds of millions of dollars, ruined people's lives, so he sits in jail till he dies. No one's made whole. People just lose money. He dies in jail. I'm not saying you shouldn't go to jail, but nothing comes from it, right? But here in Hebrew debt slavery, you work to pay off the debt, and then when you leave slavery, you're not left homeless. You're left full of money to start a new life. And Deuteronomy says, it's in your benefit. Surely you had free labor for 6 years. You can afford to fill this person's arms with goods and food before you let them go. And then there's a provision where if the person doesn't want to leave, they can stay. They can stay and pledge themselves. And there's always these codes, right? And so it's the same thing for if you go into, there's a lot of people bring up, okay, well actually we'll get to that in a minute. Let's not do that right now. The next kind of slaves, non-Hebrew slaves, war slaves, right? So Israel goes to war with neighboring nations quite frequently. Either the nations attack or God sends them to wipe them out. We think of the Amalekites and the Canaanites. So as early as Numbers, we see God command the Israelites to take slaves from conquered nations, right? So the same thing. Well, this isn't debt slavery, right? And to be fair, it's really hotly debated whether or not the year of Jubilee applies to these war slaves, right? It's not super clear whether or not they also get out in that 7th year. I think they don't, right? The year of Jubilee seems to be for Israelites and for sojourners who are either living in Israel, trying to become Israelites, but war criminals like Amalekites, Moabites that you conquer, I don't think are involved in this. We go, well, how is that fair? Right? And the answer is, again, this is a grace to them, right? Because what happens to them if any other country conquers them? What happens to every man, woman, and child? Does anyone know? They all die. All of them. And I know in modern Geneva Convention, we love to quote the Geneva Convention, including me, have no idea what it is, what it means. This was common in wars up through the Reformation. The BBC did a poll of English people's favorite Britain in the year 2000, right? And it was just a very great picture of modern England. Because number 1 was Winston Churchill, number 3 was Princess Diana. Those people are not equal. I'm not here to slam Princess Di. They did not accomplish similar things. Saving the free world from the Nazis, I don't know, not the same thing, right? Of course, because they're English, number 2 was Mr. Brunel, who built all of the trains. The English love trains, so he's their second best Englishman ever. Shakespeare all the way down to 4, right? Because you got to have the guy who built the trains first because they're English. But number 10 is Oliver Cromwell, to which I say, huzzah, I'm a Cromwell guy. Cromwell was the leader of the New Model Army, the Puritan forces that threw off, I would say, the tyrannical, homicidal reign of King Charles, instituted the Westminster Confession of Faith. I think Cromwell tried to do the best he could in the situation. So Cromwell is a hero in England to this day. They love Cromwell. If you go to Ireland, I am begging you to not bring him up. And you think I'm joking. I am not joking. The Irish have a long memory. They hate him. Hate him. And part of it is because of something called the siege at Drogheda Castle. And there's a giant castle where most of the Roman Catholic and loyalist forces to Bonnie Prince Charles are residing. And so Cromwell gets there, and he knows that if he can break this castle, the war is over. And that's a good thing. He doesn't want war. No one wants war. Forever war is terrible. He wants to end the war. So he tells the inhabitants, surrender. And they say, no, we're Irish, you're English, forget that. And so he says, as every military leader has throughout history until the post-Enlightenment age, you can surrender now, or I will kill every single one of you. And they say, forget you, we're Irish, we're English. They break the castle walls, and they kill everyone inside, right? And so, I mean, this is the great Irish and English wars. If you're Irish, you're like, war criminal. And if you're English, it's like, I promise you, you would have done the same exact thing if you were at Windsor Castle, right? So this is an unbroken line throughout warfare in human history. Actually, we can go even later than that. Is Sherman's March to the Sea, right? If you know your Civil War history, Sherman broke the South by waging total war, right? And by basically removing restrictions on his army from plundering and killing civilians, right? And they burnt whole cities like Savannah to the ground for the purpose of breaking the morale of the South in the war. And the point of that was, there's millions of people in slavery. This is what we need to do in the war, right? You can go all the way up to, famously, the dropping of the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Right, so the point is here, is that throughout human history, what you do with the people who lose is you kill all of them. And this is the oldest historical record we have of a book saying, hey, don't kill all of the kids. Don't do that. Take them as indentured servants, and then to Alexander's point, feed them, care for them. You have no right to hurt them. If you do hurt them, if you do defile them, right, if you sexually assault them, then they get to go free, and you are in trouble under the law, right? And so the war slaves, again, it sounds terrible to us now, right, but is a radical leap forward in caring for the enemies of your people, right, not just killing every man, woman, and child. And to Alexander's earlier point, they are treated better than any slave in history. And then some people argue they were even set free either at the Jubilee in 7 years, or there's a Jubilee of Jubilees the 49th year, right? 7 times 7, there's a huge Jubilee. And a lot of people argue fairly convincingly that they're set free then, right? So again, there's a what we call a sundown date. Well, there's one last type of slaves, and this is the one, yes, go ahead. What it's, go ahead. We will get to that. Spoiler alert. Sean. Right. Right. Well, and to Sean's point, it's not different now. And I think this was exactly the right thing to do. But does anyone know one of the main things we did in the 80s to kill the Soviet Empire? It worked quite effectively. Was we armed a group called the Mujahideens in Afghanistan. Right? So the Russian army was moving through Afghanistan. And so we committed millions and then billions of dollars to arming locals, right, in order to break the Soviet Empire. And it worked. It absolutely worked, right? The Russian army was routed, huge loss for them, probably sped up the fall of the Russian Empire by years and years and years, right? And then 20 years later, the name for one of those groups was the Taliban. Now, we're not going to get into Henry Kissinger realpolitik. I will tell you, I think you take that bet 10 times out of 10. The Taliban's not the Soviet Empire, right? If you have to pick which people you want to fight, you pick the Taliban over the Soviet Empire. But to Sean's point, it's the same thing now, right? You help these people, and then 10 years later, the same weapons you gave them are now being used against American soldiers, right? And that happened in the bombing in Beirut, right? Was we know that some of the weapons that were used in the bombing of Beirut were given to terrorist sects by the CIA in the 80s. So it's still Sean's point, it's still a problem. There's no magical answer now. We can't just like send them to Facebook jail and they hang out there and nothing bad ever happens, right? This is warfare. It's a serious thing. And Americans have been completely shielded from any of its ramifications really since the Second World War, right? One of the problems with Vietnam and Korea was that it was so far on the other side of the world. Vietnam kind of made a pretty good impact, but even then, Vietnam was a long time ago now, 50 years, right? And so part of the thing is we've kind of completely forgot what even warfare is. Right, no, right. I'm just saying, like, there's real world examples of it not being different. So again, the Bible's like, actually, maybe please don't kill all of them. Maybe what you do is you bring them home, you feed them, you care for them every day till they die, you have no right to hurt them or punish them, and by the way, now they're in the only place in the world that the gospel is being preached. We don't do gospel by slavery. But again, it's bad, everyone thinks, that's not the application. But overwhelmingly, this is radically humanist, like mind-blowingly better than every other alternative. Last one, betrothals. So this is when you're really going to hear Deuteronomy 21:7, husbands selling their daughters. And you think, oh man, that's just awful, right? Just terrible. Well, two things to consider. Number one, it seems to me and to most faithful biblical scholars that this kind of Hebrew slavery is exactly what ends up being outlawed in the Deuteronomic Code. That this is a very temporary situation, right? And like it or not, what this is basically describing is a betrothal. And I know nowadays that's, super don't touch that button, and you used to have to pay someone to marry your daughter. And that wasn't really what was going on. We don't have time to get into the dynamics of betrothals. But at the end of the day, this is really what's happening. When it says being sold into slavery, if you look at what's happening, right? The daughter is being given to a man, and then if he doesn't marry her, she gets to go free. Or she can live with him, but he has to provide for her as if she is his wife, and he is not allowed to take advantage of her sexually. That's a betrothal, right? And the simple fact of the matter is, that's how people got married for 90% of human history, right? And then Hugh Grant came along, and everything changed forever, right? Or Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, depends how old you are, but like, until that happened, right? You see it starting to break in Jane Austen's novels, and there's a couple of betrothals in her novels, and no one talks about them like they're bad things. Oh yeah, it's part of life. Of course you're betrothed, but lucky for everyone else, Darcy falls in love with Elizabeth. But Darcy is betrothed in Pride and Prejudice to somebody else, and never once is that spoken of as a bad thing, right? It's just ultimately that this other woman can't marry Darcy; she's too sick, and so the betrothal is broken, and he marries Elizabeth. So the fact of the matter is, for most of human history, and by the way, guess where this still happens? Just the world's largest country, India, which passed China some time ago. We just didn't figure it out because China likes to lie. But now, inarguably, India is the world's most populous country, and betrothal is exceedingly common in India. It's exceedingly common in first and second generation Indian immigrants to America. Betrothal is still practiced, right? And so my kids are not betrothed, and they're not open for it. We're not open to betrothal, if you're wondering. But at the same time, there's no way we can look at this. It would be really smug and condescending to look at betrothal and say that it's wrong. That's chronological snobbery, right? There's nothing wrong with betrothal. And so what Exodus is doing is it's setting up ways to protect these women. If you do this functionally betrothal, right? There's daughter, there's money, there's dowry, things are going back and forth. If you do this, then just know that either you or your son has to marry her, and even if you don't, then you have to take care of her, and she's not just a slavery sex object, which is, by the way, how every form of ancient slavery was, including Roman slaves, which were largely treated as objects of sexual gratification, right? Any free person was allowed to do anything they wanted to any slave in the Roman Republic, right? This paragon of elected and virtue, and that's how they treated slaves. But functionally, it's talking about a type of betrothal that it says, if that happens, you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to respect her, you have to treat her well, you have to set her free. If you don't marry her, And then, by the way, she's a Hebrew slave, so 7 years she'll be set free. And by the way, taking Hebrew slaves is eventually kaput outside of debt slavery by the time Deuteronomy rolls around. So when people go, oh, the Bible condones slavery, you just go, really? Show me. Like, can we talk about it for 5 minutes? Or did you hear about that on an episode of The West Wing and you just want to seem smart? Which is almost always what happens, right? And even really aggressive critics of the Bible admit slavery is not something that you just get to take a swing at, right? There are really clear implications that this is overwhelmingly indentured servitude or grace for enemies who would otherwise have been slaughtered, or dowries. And again, only the Jewish law code in history has a sundown clause where slaves get to go free after 7 and 49 years, where they have to be treated with all of the same laws and respect as normal citizen, and when they leave, you have to pay them. Right? That's Hebrew slavery. So the idea that God condones evil because he condones slavery is farcical. It is a bad faith argument, and just tell people, keep reading. Like, where in the Bible is that? Like, go through it with me, and when you dive into it, it's anything but evil. It's yet another example of God's justice and God's mercy. All right, here's the next one. God's a megalomaniac. That's a big word. People love to throw it out, right? God's a megalomaniac. You go, oh, you must be smart. That word is like 5 syllables. Megalomaniac. Well, what I would want to do is, why don't you define megalomaniac for me? What is a megalomaniac? What is megalomania? Right, so you look it up. Modern dictionaries are almost overwhelmingly terrible. But a modern dictionary like Webster's Online will like, oh, it's an obsessive need for power. And you go, aha, God is a megalomaniac. It's not what the word means. Right, megalomania, especially if you break down the root words, is a narcissistic, delusional grab of power. Right, is when someone who does not deserve it and does not have it seeks it, pretends they have it, and uses it narcissistically, selfishly. So that's what people are actually accusing God of, is that he is abusing his power and using it wrongly, right? So let's just be clear what they're arguing. God is abusing his power, and he's using it wrongly. So let's talk about the first one Dan brought up, the Amalekite ban. Dan brought up that there are times in the Bible when God's people are specifically called to slaughter a whole people, not to take them as slaves, not to spare the women and the children, but everyone has to die, including the sheep and the cows have to die. And one of the people who suffer what we call a ban, and we think that means like, oh, ban, they're not allowed to be anymore, but ban actually means devotion, like you're devoting them to God in the slaughter, right? It's they're being given over to slaughter because of God's commandment. That's what a ban means in this context. So there's an Amalekite ban. Well, is that God being a megalomaniac? Is that him narcissistically grabbing onto things and doing what's wrong to please himself, right? Was it unjust for God to kill the Amalekites? Read the Bible. Define megalomania for me and read the Bible. The first time you meet the Amalekites is in Exodus 17, when the Hebrews are a nation of women and children fleeing slavery. And the Amalekites are waiting in ambush for them to slaughter as many women and children as possible. And so there's a great battle that happens when the Amalekites basically pounce on refugees to try to slaughter them. The next time we hear about the Amalekites, guess what they're up to? Again, they do it again, right? They wait a little while, but then the next thing they do is they wait for the Hebrews to be defenseless, and again they fall upon women and children and try to slaughter them. What's the next time we hear the Amalekites? Is in Judges chapter 3, where the Amalekites have been unsuccessful, so now they team up with another people who hate the Israelites, the Moabites. And it says the Amalekites devoted themselves entirely as a nation to helping the Moabites oppress the Israelites. The whole country was just trying to make sure that the Moabites conquered and enslaved Israel. That doesn't work. So if you're guessing, how do the Amalekites work, right? If once you don't try, fail again. Judges 6, now they help the Midianites. Didn't work in Judges 3, so they're going to do it again. And now the whole country wants to enslave Israel and murder the women and children by now helping the Midianites. They go to another tribe and try to get them to kill. So so God says, kill them all. Slaughter every last man, woman, and child. And if you know the story, it doesn't happen, right? There is a king left, the king of the Amalekites, and so Samuel goes to visit Saul, and he hears animals bleeding. And Samuel says, what do I hear? And Saul says, well, I didn't kill the animals and I didn't kill the king because I thought they'd be a good prize. And Samuel says, how dare you? You think you're wiser than God, right? And this is one of the reasons that Saul has the kingdom ripped from him, is his rejection of God. And so Saul is functionally us. I'm wiser than God. I don't think it's fair for all the Amalekites to die. Right? I know what's best. This seemed unnecessary, so we'll keep them alive. Right? God's being a megalomaniac. They don't all need to die. Nothing bad's going to come of this. I thought of this when Sean mentioned, what do you do? Does anyone know when the Amalekites pop up again? Alexander. The book of Esther. So hundreds, thousands of years later, we meet a man named, do you know the bad guy in Esther? Haman, who is an Amalekite. And all Haman is now dedicating his life to is destroying all of the Israelites. And the whole book of Esther is Haman's evil plan through these really insidious machinations to make sure every man, woman, and child of the Jews is slaughtered by the Persian king. Right? And all of this because Saul didn't obey God. And he left the Amalekites alive, and now they've come back for revenge. Right? And it is only God's direct intervention through Mordecai and through Esther that dramatically saves the Hebrew people from destruction, and finally Haman is killed. He's hung by the very noose that he sets up, right? And that's Haman's end, because the Bible is amazing, is a perfect picture of the Amalekites, right? In the beginning of the book of Esther, Haman builds a giant gallows, and his plan is to hang Mordecai from it. And his plan is for it to be so high that it's above all of the roofs of the city, because Mordecai is not only evil, he's lazy, and he wants to be able to see Mordecai swinging from the noose from his seat in the palace, right? Like, think of the level of evil. Like, I am so bloodthirsty that the thing I want to see when I'm eating breakfast is the genocide of the Jews, right? Well, there was somebody else like that. Does anyone in modern history ever be like, well, I don't think it was really fair what we did to the Nazis? They're the byword now for evil, right? Anyone who disagrees with you on the internet is a Nazi. They're the bad guy. Yeah, this is Haman writ large. But at the end of the story, the very tool that Haman wanted to use to kill all the Jews, God used to kill Haman. And that's exactly what's happened with the Amalekites. These are a people of violence and sin and destruction. And all they want to do is wreak violence and sin and destruction on the world. And so when God says they need to be put down like a rabid dog, he is not being megalomaniac. He is being righteous. He is being judge. Lest we condemn General Eisenhower for putting down Nazis at Normandy. God is being judge. He's putting down vicious, rabid wolves who are seeking destruction. And when God's people think they're smarter than God and don't do it, all that happens is what? More death and destruction. So God is not being narcissistic. God is not seeking a power that's not his own. And God is not being unfair. The only people that are being narcissistic, seeking power that's not their own, and being unfair is who? The Israelites when they don't kill them, which is the source of real destruction. Right? So who's the megalomaniac in the story? Answer, we are. Human beings suffer from megalomania writ large. Right? We are dyed-in-the-wool narcissists who seek power to achieve our own end when God does the exact opposite. So the Amalekites are totally deserving of their destruction, and in fact, only bad things happen when we don't obey. But let's just get even more precise, right? So we'll talk about, I think, this number 2 thing people bring up, which is the Canaanite ban, right? And that's the idea that God is cruel. Because the Canaanite ban in Deuteronomy 20 is presented a lot more blatantly, right? You don't see this history, right? The Canaanites aren't popping out in Exodus 17. They're just there. And God says in Deuteronomy 20, when you get there, make sure you kill all of them. Don't make a covenant with them. All these wicked treaties, Edom, Midian, make covenants with them. And actually God rebukes Israelites for not holding to their promises to these wicked nations generations later. But the Canaanites, right, there are very few tribes that God says, and Canaanites are one of them, don't marry them, don't talk to them, don't live in the same zip code with them. All of them have to go, right? And when we're saying that, man, that sounds cruel. How could that be? Right? How could that be that every man, woman, and child has to go? Well, again, this is why we have to actually read the Bible and not use it as a cudgel to justify our Rebellion. My Old Testament professor, Dr. Curd, who I quote a lot, wonderful man, wonderful teacher, read anything you can by him, he liked to say that the Canaanites had a PhD in cruelty. Right? So it's not presented in the series of vignettes like the Amalekites are. But the Canaanites actually show up all the way back in the book of Genesis. Yes? So it really starts with Abraham, and it's one of those blink and you miss it passages, which is why you should study the Bible, where Abraham has contact with him. And God tells Abraham not to kill the Canaanites. Don't kill them. Why? And God says, because they have not yet filled up their sin, which is one of those verses that gives me goosebumps. And so God allows them to continue as the picture of perversity and abominations and sin for 400 years. 400 years. Think about the leash God gives the Canaanites. So in the time of Abraham, God says, no, they have not yet filled up their sin. The judgment is not going to come. It's going to tarry. It's going to wait. So that when Deuteronomy comes around, they have, to quote John Currid, a PhD in cruelty. They have been studying and perfecting it for 400 years. The real question we should be asking is not why does God ordinate a Canaanite ban in Deuteronomy 20, it's why does he wait? Because what do the Canaanites do? They are of the most violent nations in human history, up there with the Assyrians. They practice warfare on scales previously unrecorded in ancient history. Right? They revel in bloodshed. Some people think they invented the practice of flaying human beings, peeling off someone's skin while they're still alive. There's some evidence the Canaanites seem to be the first people to figure that out. Canaanites also, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, practice as a regular part of their life child sacrifice in their worship. And that child sacrifice, and this is an intense thing, so I'm sorry, that child sacrifice included cannibalism. So they would kill and then eat the children as a part of their worship of their false gods, right? Never mind cultic prostitution, which was really sexual assault because none of the people who are cult prostitutes signed up for it. No one signs up to be a cult prostitute. And so we're talking about ritualized, ordained, regularly practiced, government-sanctioned child sacrifice, cannibalism, and sexual assault for 400 years. And we say, why did they all deserve to die? This is why R.C. Sproul yelled, "What's wrong with you people?" Right? That's not what's insane. What's insane is that God allows them to repent. There is a Canaanite in the Hall of Faith. Does anyone know the Canaanite's name? Rahab. In the Hall of Faith. Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah, Rahab was not a Walgreens manager in an unfortunate part of town. Rahab was one of these cultic prostitutes. Right? Which meant we don't know. I mean, it's speculation, but we know what was going on inside those temples, and it wasn't just prostitution. And yet, Rahab begs God's forgiveness, and God forgives her. That's the only thing that's unjust. And yet it is just because Christ takes Rahab's sin. And so for 400 years, the Canaanites could repent. And they didn't. And every one of them, man, woman, and child, chose evil. And this is what the Bible says of them. Their hearts were filled with nothing but wickedness all day long. All they did was practice the most unimaginable evil. Right? And so we say that God must be just, and he must put an end to them, which brings us to our final point, which is the flood. Which if people aren't going to the flood, take them there. Right? You want to talk about the Canaanite ban, you want to talk about the Amalekites, you want to talk about Exodus 21. The entire human species is wiped out except for one family. Right? Like let's cut to the quick here. Every man, woman, and child on the planet dies. But this gets to the heart of the issue, right? People's objection is not that God is a megalomaniac, because they don't know what that word means. And if they did, they'd understand that he's not the megalomaniac. Their objection is not that God's cruel. Human beings are cruel. Their objection is that God is sovereign. That's really the root issue, is that God is sovereign over life and death. that he is sovereign over judging people, and that's what we don't like, and that's what the flood brings into relief. And so whenever we're talking about sovereignty, I think one of the best people to quote is a French theologian, mathematician, Blaise Pascal. And he talks about this constant rebellion against God's lordship is exactly because we have this gaping hole at the center of our souls, right? We've ripped away the creator and author of life, the only one who's just, the only one who controls life, and we feel the void within us and we rage against it, right? He says, what else does that craving and helplessness proclaim but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that remains now is an empty print and trace, and this he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help that he cannot find in what is. People don't write like that anymore. This is what another professor at RTS called the Macbeth quandary. Has everyone had to read Macbeth? High school? Has anyone seen? There was actually a really good Denzel Washington version of it recently. Okay. Things don't end well for Macbeth. If you're familiar with the story, it starts out Macbeth is like a pretty happy, low-level noble in Scotland. Right? He's married. He just won a battle. Things are going well. Happens across some witches who entice him and say, listen, if you commit some murders and deceit and all these sins, then you get to be king of Scotland. Right? And so we know the story of Macbeth is a tragic one. It's the descent into more and more sin, where they murder and then they cover it up, and the conscience torments them, and they become these really wicked, awful versions of themselves, which is a wonderful picture of what sin does to us, right? It corrupts us from the inside out. And so that's the story of Macbeth, right? It's how sin just corrupts this man. And he was promised, right? Part of the reason he feels confident in doing this is because the witches say, well, no one who was born of a woman can kill you. And so Macbeth says, oh, well, good deal. That's everybody, right? So I'll just stay away, I guess, from like bears and wolves, and I'll be fine. And then at the end of the book, you find out the person who, Macbeth is fighting, and he's loudly boasting, no one can kill me, like no one can judge me for my sin, because no one born of a woman can kill me. And then the knight facing him says, well, funny that you mentioned that. I wasn't born of a woman. I had to be ripped out of my dying mother's stomach. Now, who does Macbeth file a complaint to? Is it the witches? Is it Shakespeare? Right? Macbeth's probably pretty aggrieved. Like, hold on, the deal was that no one could kill me. Right? When I signed the contract, what I understood it to mean was that no one could kill me. And now you're saying that there's some magical, like, that's not fair. Right? Macbeth says, I don't want to die. I don't think this is fair. Who is Macbeth going to complain to? And we're sitting here pretending like this is a silly argument, when it's not functionally a single iota more or less silly than human beings crying out to God, how dare you do what you want with your creation? Macbeth can't lodge a complaint with Shakespeare. He's Shakespeare's property. Shakespeare can do with Macbeth that which he wants, right? And this is what Paul says in Romans chapter 9, right? If God is sovereign, if God decides who dies and who lives, if salvation is only possible when God chooses to redeem sinners, how is that fair? And then the answer is, who are you, O man, to answer back to your Creator? You fundamentally misunderstand the situation. You have no more right to complain to God than Macbeth has to complain to Shakespeare. He made you, he owns you, and you are in rebellious, wicked sin against him. Right? And so the flood brings this issue out. It's not that God kills Canaanites. It's not that God kills Amalekites. It's that every single person who has ever died on this earth died according to God's will. All of them, including my mom, including maybe someone you love. All of them died under God's rule. That's the situation we're dealing with here, right? But what's helpful about that, right, is maybe it begins to knock the scales off the eyes and help human beings realize who we're dealing with and who we're talking to here, right? There is no war against heaven, right? The Bible uses that language, but it's not like it's a two-sided fight, right? It's not like the armies of Satan are close to winning and, oh no, we better launch a sneak. Like, that's not how it works. And human beings have to radically reorient themselves away from this enlightenment, I think, therefore I am the judge. You live and die under the auspices of God's will. That's your problem. And you need to reconcile that, because it will happen to you. But the very fact that you are alive right now, there's only one word for it, and that word is grace. Right? Because when Adam was in the garden, he was told, if you eat of the fruit, this day you will surely die. And then he ate of the fruit. And did Adam die that day? No, he did not. The speck of dust that spit in the face of goodness and light and love itself, that chose death and rebellion and perversity over life and love, and was promised to die the day he did, what God did was he picked him up, covered his nakedness, gave him food to eat, air to breathe, and sustained his life for several hundred years. I promise you this, on Adam's deathbed, Adam did not turn to God and say, God, it's unfair that I'm dying. Right? Adam said, it's all grace. Right? Now, we do understand that those who reject God forever, their grace, and this is a biblical doctrine, is the kind of grace that was shown to the Canaanites. It is because their sin is not yet full. Right? And so that's why the Bible says that they store up wrath for themselves. Right? And so although it is God's common grace that rain falls on the just and on the unjust, ultimately for those that choose the way of Canaan and Amalekite over God, they're storing up wrath, just like the Canaanites and Amalekites. But no one can say that the sovereignty of God is unjust. Right? The only thing we could say is that the grace of God is unjust if it had not been earned specifically by Jesus. And so clearly you can probably get a sense, this is my favorite objection to hear in the wild, by far. Let's talk about death. It's going to happen to you, and I know the one whose fate you hold. Right? Let's get really real about this. You're raising your fist against the heavens. It doesn't work like that. So let's get into it. Right? There's someone who holds your life in his hands. How would you talk to him if that was true? Is this how you talk to him? Right? When all of your objections are straw man, red herring, Mott and Bailey logical failures? No. Right? And so this is a wonderful opportunity, like Pascal says, to make people reckon with the void that they have in them. They know that's not the way it should be, and they're raging against the dying of the light. Right? So I went a little bit long. I guess I'll close with the story I want to close with was my grandfather, not a believer, died. War hero, wealthy man, did a lot of stuff in his life. He died. Right? Turns out having a silver star doesn't save you from that. And he asked my brother at his funeral to read, I think I've mentioned this before, the worst poem ever written, which is a poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley, right, Invictus, where the author says, no matter how charged with punishments the scroll, no matter how narrow the gate, which I'm sure you remember is a reference to the Bible and then to, right, the way is narrow. So no matter how charged with punishments the scroll, no matter how narrow the gate, I am the master of my soul, I am the captain of my fate. And I remember that being read over my dad's coffin. And it felt like a mockery. Like some captain. This is where what a stupid poem to have written. Like, there's my grandfather lying in the ground. He thought he was the captain of his fate. Didn't seem to help him. Right? And so I love when people, let's ask about the Amalekites. Let's ask about the Canaanites. Let's ask about Noah. Because I know that you know that there's an answer. So anyway, questions, thoughts?